My name is Chloe Cole, and I am a detransitioner and a formerly trans-identified teenager. I went through the process of a social and medical gender transition between the ages of 12 to 16 years old, and I now speak on behalf of that experience that I went through with my family in hopes that I will help other children who are experiencing the same distress and other young men and women, as well as their parents and their families who are currently dealing with this with them. When I was a girl, I actually started out very early in my life, very feminine. I loved pink, I loved dresses, and I loved playing dress up with my older sisters. But I also really loved being in the presence of my male peers and of my older brothers and being with my dad, especially as I got older and as I hit puberty. I just found that they were a lot more easygoing and a lot easier to relate to. I started to feel as though my growing boyishness was starting to make it so that I was becoming lonelier, and I found it harder to relate to the other people around me. It was something that I was very conscious of, something that I thought was setting me apart from the other girls my age. And I naively started to think, well, because I'm a tomboy, and because I find growing up from a girl into a woman and going through the motions of a female puberty so difficult, that maybe I just would have been happier if I were born a boy, if I were more like my older brothers, and if I had the body of a man. At 12 years old, I decided that I was going to reinvent myself. I named myself Leo, and I started calling myself a boy to my peers, to my online friends, and eventually I told my mother and father about these feelings that I had. And they understood that I was having a rough time with my identity, that I was dealing with some of the struggles of being an awkward girl who had a learning disability and was naturally just a little bit more tomboyish. And they loved me the very same. But they also were not very sure about how to go about this with me. They knew that this was something that had to be related to my disability and to some of my social struggles and my academic struggles. So they turned to the help of the medical professionals because they thought that in doing so, they would understand exactly what was going on with me. And they would help me to get onto the pathway to getting better, to understanding myself and my identity as a woman better, to learning how to cope with these feelings of difficulty around these things. Until at the very least, I was an adult and more capable of understanding maybe what it was that I wanted later in life, and that I would be fully grown by then. To their shock, they were not allowed in their room during these therapy sessions. The psychologists who I was speaking to never spoke to them about what was discussed during these appointments. So they were not only completely in the dark about what was going on in my head, but also about what was actually discussed during this time. They saw that I was going to therapy, and yet I was getting worse. I wasn't getting any better. So they decided to take matters into their own hands and speak to the doctors themselves. And they were very reasonable in their concerns. My mom and dad asked them questions like, where are these feelings coming from for her? Why does she want to be a boy so badly? Why does she think that she needs to take male hormones in order to be who she really is? Why must we do this at such a young age for her? What could the repercussions be for her development? What could happen to her if she ends up regretting this? What do we do then? But the doctors didn't care. All of these concerns that my mom and dad had, they just pushed back against. They told them that they don't have to worry about any of that. They told them that, well, we expect you to refer to her by male pronouns, by her preferred male name, because this is not a choice. If she wants to go on these interventions, she absolutely has to. If you deny her of this, well, you're risking having a dead daughter versus a living, happy, thriving transgender son. They fed them this narrative that were I not allowed to follow this lifestyle, I would be dead and the blood would be on the hands of my parents. My mom and dad were faced with the single greatest fear that any parent could ever have around their child, and that is outliving them. And with this narrative being shoved down their throats, they took the only option that was given to us. I don't blame them for signing off because they were made to be afraid for my life. Before I was finished with 8th grade, I began my first medical intervention. They used a drug called Lupron, which has previously been used in late-stage reproductive cancers and also to chemically castrate sex offenders for my healthy body, to stop my puberty in its tracks. And just a month after that, I was given a weekly dosage of male hormones. And my body began to masculinize. I began to look and sound more like a teenage boy with each coming day. And as I went into my high school years, I looked pretty much like any other teenage boy. In fact, I actually, believe it or not, my voice was actually deeper than that of my male peers because the drugs that I was on were so powerful. Other than the kids who I had went to middle school with, none of them knew that I actually was a girl. And so I was socialized as a teenage boy. I was now Leo to my peers and to my teachers. And I even began to use male locker room facilities and restroom facilities, which, for those of you who have never been in a high school boys' restroom, consider yourselves lucky. That might have actually been one of my least favorite parts of the experience. I don't know what's wrong with you people. I don't know how I thought I was one of you guys. But for a while, it was just such a novel, interesting experience. It was like a whole new life had been created for me. I was leaving behind my old dead self as a little girl named Chloe, and I was now entering the life of a handsome young boy named Leo. And I started to realize after a while that it wasn't all that it was chalked up to be. It was quite a lonely experience, in fact, having to essentially put on a mask every day. Nobody knew the truth about me. It felt like nobody really knew or loved me. And I began to grow lonely. But I didn't feel as though I could speak about this to anybody. I had no idea that this process could actually hurt me, that it could bring me pain in any way. But I was falling into a deep, deep depression. I began to withdraw socially. My grades at school began to tank. I started to fail out of my classes. I started to spend all of my time in my room. And even though I clearly was in a declining, rapidly becoming more depressed state. My doctors looked at me and they said, "You're good to go for your next intervention." Even though I had been diagnosed with and medicated for ADHD and medicated for my failing school performance, I was placed again onto the medical pipeline, and I was on my way to surgery. And before I could legally drive a car, I underwent my first and my only surgical intervention during this period of my life. I went under the knife, and I had a radical double mastectomy to remove my breasts at 15 years old. That might have been the most I had ever been celebrated in my life. I went back home. I was excited to finally get through with the healing process, to finally be able to take my shirt off, to be like all of the other boys and men, and not have to worry about these things I thought that I didn't want on my chest anymore. My transgender friends and my friends who called themselves allies congratulated me for getting this part of me removed. And yet, even though I was so far into this journey, even though I was getting so much praise from the people around me, I started to realize that I was feeling grief, that I was losing more and more parts of myself every day. But I couldn't put a name to this feeling yet. I couldn't admit to myself yet how much this was destroying me, because I didn't know that it was possible. And yet, as I looked at other women my age, I started to figure out that I was feminine, that I loved those parts of myself, that I wanted to grow up into a young woman just like them. And when I was 16, less than a year after I had my surgery, I had an epiphany. I was soon to become an adult. I had to start thinking about my future. Do I want to go to college? Do I want to get married? What about having children of my own one day? And the answer was yes. I wanted to fulfill the role of a wife in a marriage. I wanted to be able to get pregnant, to naturally have children of my own, to nurse them. And without breasts, I never would even have a chance at knowing what that special act between infant and mother is like, ever. I don't even know now if I'm going to be able to have children of my own naturally. And this realization broke me. It shattered everything that I thought I had known about my identity. And I knew that even though I had no idea what my life was going to look like afterward, I couldn't continue to go on this path because it was destroying me physically and mentally. Without much support from my doctors or psychologists, or even the transgender community, I made the choice to detransition. And it was probably the lowest period in my life. I thought that I was alone. I would turn to my doctors for help. And now they didn't have any answers for me. They wouldn't help me anymore with things even as simple as going off of the hormones, with dealing with the trauma that came before and during my transition. I was completely in the dark for a while. And then I found out that I wasn't alone. I started to encounter first other young women and then young men who had been through the exact same thing as I. I found comfort in this community that we had started to build and bond over. And yet I was terrified over this very same fact. How could I live with knowing that there are children, there are men, there are women out there who know my pain and not do something about it? I started to feel as though I had a responsibility to start speaking up about my own story and to advocate not only for those men and women who have come out the other side, but also for the women and men and everyone who is still struggling with these feelings of confusion around one's sex. And I didn't really expect much out of it when I started to speak out publicly when I was 17. I was still in high school, but I decided to start small with a little Twitter account. I didn't really think that I would really reach anywhere. And then I started having reporters reaching out to me. I started having parents who had lost their children asking me for help. I started having different publications speaking to me, platforming my story. And then began a years-long journey of advocacy. At a time when I didn't think that I had much of a life left, that I thought I had lost my purpose. At that very same time, I began this journey of speaking out, not only about what happened to me, but also thousands of other children in my generation. In so little time, it's been less than 3 years since it has began. And I have seen miracles. I have seen things happen in places where we never thought they would. And I discovered faith along the way. I wasn't raised with much of a faith background at all. My mother was a Filipino immigrant and was raised Catholic, and my father was raised in the Mormon church. But in spite of that, they never really took me to church past the age of 4. And I feel like that is in large part what led to my struggles with my identity, my understanding of myself, of my sex, of my body, and of the world around me. And that didn't come until much later, until I chose to speak out. I began to speak to many Christians. I began speaking at different churches about my testimony. And through these people, my old beliefs and my old values were challenged. And I came to realize that I was called to speak. That nothing that I had gone through had actually taken away from me. Not the loss of my breasts, not the loss of the years of my childhood. It all happened for a purpose. And through all of the experiences, good and bad, I have been strengthened. And many parents have unfortunately allowed these negative experiences that they may have had with religious institutions run by people, run by humanity, which is imperfect, to interfere with their own personal relationship with God. And thus they have chosen to deny their children that same foundation of faith. But we're at a time when children need it more than ever because their godly innocence and their families that were made to protect and raise them are under attack. And now, as adults, as Christians, we have a responsibility to bring these people who are struggling with their sex, with their bodies, with their trauma, into our congregations. We have to be that rock for them, to encourage them to look to God. We all have a responsibility to fight for the children and the integrity of families in our communities. Because I come from California, right? And there are a lot of people out there who think, oh man, it must suck for families out there in California to be growing up like that. But do not think that this is just a California issue for one moment. Because I have been all across the country. I've been international. And in every community that I've spoken to, I've met at least one person who has been affected by this ideology. Take initiative and do not wait until it is your own family, your own community, your own child or grandchild who is being affected by this. You must be a leader for the people around you and do your part to guide the younger generations because they are the future of this world. If I could choose to start speaking up and become a leader in the fight against this demonic, extinctionist ideology at the age of 17, you all could do the very same. Thank you all for coming here tonight.
Chloe, absolutely amazing, and you just blew it out of the park again. We have a few minutes extra, and I told her, I said, take your time, say what you want to say, and she said, I might talk for about half an hour, and honestly, I was sitting there gobsmacked, and Pastor Kelly was saying, let her go, so if you have anything else to say, we're all ears, but I do have some questions, if you're open to that.
Yes, I'd love to.
All right. Wow. Are you impressed? Can you believe 20 years old? Wow. And you know something? My heart just flipped when God is talking to you and you're listening to him, and it's apparent. It's apparent that you have a relationship with him. What a blessing. All right, so our first question, what one thing would you say to someone who's in the shoes that you were in as an early teen?
I actually have spoken to teenagers who are in different stages of the transition or questioning process. And to all of them, I've stressed the reality to them, the biblical and scientific reality that they are one sex or the other. They are a boy or a girl. That is the way that they were born. That is the way that they will stay for life. It is immutable. And that the way that they were made is not the problem. That even though they may feel different, perhaps they're more effeminate boys or more masculine girls, that doesn't take away from who they are. That is something, these things are what make them unique. These are gifts that might feel awkward to deal with during such a time in your life where there is so much change and so much social pressure. But these are beautiful things that eventually you will grow into. And it's okay to struggle. It's normal during this period of your life to struggle with with the fact that you're growing from a child into an adult and the awkwardness that comes with that. It's normal to struggle with those changes in your body, in your social life, at school. Because all of that change, all of those hardships, it all happens to make you into a stronger adult. You just have to trust the process. And a lot of these kids who are struggling with these feelings around their body and around the way that they're born, often I see a lot of commonalities with them. Many of them have been abused in some way, either physically or emotionally, or oftentimes sexually. And that is in large part where some of my own distress came from. I had sexual trauma from before I even had a first boyfriend or a first kiss. Many of these kids have some sort of struggle with their own family. Many of them have a parent who is out of the picture, or they've been through the foster care system. And a lot of them are just on the autistic spectrum, or they have some sort of learning disability or some sort of comorbid psychiatric condition. And that is what, these doctors are doing a huge disservice to these patients by not exploring that first. Because gender dysphoria is not something that just happens on its own. It's not an innate thing to feel this way. There is no gene, there is no physiological marker or brain structure that determines whether somebody is gender dysphoric or transgender. It comes from a place of pain. And that is something that has to be explored first and foremost. And you have to find your identity through some other means. Because who you are is so much more than the clothing that you wear. It's so much more than the way that you style or cut your hair. It's more than what you call yourself. Your identity ultimately comes from the things that you do. Whether it be a skill that you have, whether it be hobbies that you have, or the work that you do for your family or your community. I firmly believe that our identities are nestled most firmly in our families and in following God.
Amen. Wow. I can't tell if you're a preacher or a doctor, but she's got a lot of knowledge, doesn't she? Second question for you. Yeah, you're right on it. That's where you are. Number two, the second question, what one thing could a physician or other adult have said or done to turn you away from transitioning?
It's not like one thing immediately would have just turned me away from this, because I was stubborn. Children are stubborn in general, especially around the preteen and the adolescent ages. It's just a normal part of development. And I firmly believed at the time that I was a boy. It would have been a process to get me to desist. But the most important thing that the doctors could have done was told me no and not have allowed me to undergo any of this. And there might have been a bit of a fight. I would have not been happy at all about that for probably a very long time. But if an adult, especially one of the psychologists, had stressed to me that I was different and that was okay, that I could be a more tomboyish girl, that being a woman or a man didn't have to confine me to a set of behavior or presentation, that I could just be myself and be allowed to explore that through hobbies, through different ways of dressing myself. I think eventually I would have learned how to be okay with myself. And I would have had all of my body and all of my bodily function intact.
Wow. I know that there's a statistic that I use, and it says that 85% of gender dysphoric teenagers, if they're left alone, if they're not encouraged to transition or take hormones, 85% of them are completely happy in their biology by the time they're in their mid-20s.
So historically, I mean, we used to follow, when treating children who have gender distress, we used to follow a wait-and-see approach, actually. We wouldn't interfere, we wouldn't affirm this identity that they had, and we certainly wouldn't medicalize them. We just waited until they were at least 18 and out of puberty to see what happened then.
Right.
And for the most part, most of these kids would desist from this identity, and they would grow to be happy in their bodies and with their sex.
So, Chloe, I want to hit the political part just a little bit, if you don't mind.
That's fine.
Okay, all right, good. She's not afraid of anything. As a matter of fact, tell us again why it is that we're cutting our visit short with you, because you have to go back home, would you?
So this is actually one of many stops on one big trip. In fact, I've had a pretty crazy week. I could have actually not made it here because I was recently, well, it started with me being in Arizona, and I recently got into off-road driving as a hobby. I almost got stuck in the desert at night, and I very well could have not made it to the airport.
Oh, my.
So I'm very thankful that I didn't, and I'm here.
Well, we think God had a plan, yeah.
But I was previously at the American Academy of Pediatrics convention. We managed to make our way in, and I left a day early, but there were other detransitioners, actually, and some medical providers who were working at that booth, and today they got kicked out. I'm just sad I wasn't able to see that, because that would have been
so funny.
It was very interesting.
Is this
I'm surprised we didn't get kicked out on the first day.
Right. Is
I
this
saw
the
some
one in
people
Orlando?
eyeing us, and they were not so happy.
Is this the one in Orlando that you just left?
Yes.
Okay, so tell us about that. So you had to go in with a fictitious name, am I right?
Not quite fictitious. I just
Okay.
took parts of my legal name.
Okay.
So,
All right, so Chloe was in there, you and your brother, Mitch, right?
yes.
Okay, and what was that like?
And believe it or not, most of the doctors were actually unaware of what was going on, that was happening to so many children across the country and internationally. But they were very curious, and they were grateful for us speaking about our perspective. So the American Academy of Pediatrics kicking our booth out on the very last day shows that they don't actually care about representing the opinions and the feelings and the judgments of those doctors who are all attending. And they don't care about these patients, and certainly not these children who they are harming with their medical dogma. They don't care about these physicians who want to practice the best way that they see fit and don't think that it is okay to mutilate or castrate perfectly healthy children who are struggling. And believe it or not, this is not the last stop of my trip. I'm actually going to be speaking in Missouri on a case about a law that they have passed to protect children from going through what I have.
Amen. Yeah. That's on Thursday? Is that this Thursday?
Well, I mean, it's projected for... I was originally projected to speak on Wednesday, but the legal process is slow, and these hearings can often be dragged out. So I could be speaking as late as evening on I think, do you say Thursday or Friday?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but we know that we have to let you go sooner because she's going to be speaking in court again. Yeah.
It wouldn't be my first court case, actually.
No, I'm sure. How many times have you spoken before Congress?
Well, I actually recently spoke to Congress as well. The first time was on my 19th birthday. And I spoke to them again a few weeks ago at the family caucus that they were holding on this issue. and also individually to different legislators and senators in their offices in the Capitol.
Wow. Isn't that amazing? Yes, absolutely.
It gives me a lot of hope seeing all of these senators from across the states being so receptive and supportive.
Yeah.
Because just a few years ago, because this was an issue that seemed to be so fraught with controversy, even Republicans and those on the right were so afraid to touch it because they were afraid of being canceled. They were afraid of the backlash that would come. And it's so crazy that that voices like mine have enabled those legislators to be able to continue to start speaking up about their constituents and their families. And even maybe a little nugget of hope to give here. As a Californian, I've worked with different Californian organizations and different people in California, and there is a rapidly growing movement
Amen.
of those of us there who are starting to fight back, not only against our own government, but against this ideology and this movement that is seeking to take away our children.
Amazing. Okay, so Chloe, another question that I have for you is, how has this issue affected your relationship with God?
I mean, again, as a kid, I didn't really have that background of faith. And I wouldn't say that for most of my childhood or adolescence that I was atheist necessarily. I was more on the agnostic side. I believed that there was very possibly a God out there because humans are foolish. We are not perfect. To think that we are the most intelligent, the most capable beings out there, and with our limited senses, that we can see everything, I think that is foolish. But when I was suffering through this process, I started to become convinced that the only reason that I was put on this earth was to suffer.
Wow.
I didn't know why, but I thought that that was all that my life was going to be, that I was going to be alone and in pain forever. I thought that if there was a God out there, he must hate me for who I am. And I didn't quite come to until I began my journey of speaking out, actually, as my Christian friends, as pastors began to reach out to me, as they began to give the word of God to me. And as they showed me their compassion, their love, I began to understand that there is a God, that he created me, and he did so with love. And no matter what I did to myself, no matter what parts of my body had been taken away, no matter what medicine I had taken, the only thing that I had ever been to him was his daughter.
That's right. Chloe, this Bible verse just popped right up in my mind, and I want to share it with you. The Bible says that when Jesus comes to take us home, that our mortality will put on immortality. And it says that we are changed in the twinkling of an eye, and everything that's been done to us and everything that you submitted to or whatever, it'll be restored. I'll have my hair back, right? Will be restored. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't God amazing? He makes things right. Beautiful, beautiful. All right, so just enough time for maybe one question more. Could you explain to people what the bottom surgery is like for a woman?
I mean, I didn't undergo the genital surgery, so I'm not really an expert. Well, I don't really feel that I'm super qualified to speak about it, but there are multiple kinds, which I don't want to, there are children here, and I don't want to get too graphic about what it entails. But for the main one that they use, they actually take away skin from the arm or from the leg, and they graft it into the new set of artificial genitalia.
Right.
And as with the mastectomy, there are major complications
That's right.
associated with it. And again, no matter what these doctors, no matter what these surgeons prescribe or do to their patients, it cannot mimic the real form or function
That's right.
of the opposite sex. There is the very premise of transition, both the medical and the social aspect of it, is based on a fantasy. Because you cannot change your sex. It is not something that we can determine.
Mm-hmm.
Only God can.
That's right.
And it stays with us for life. To think that we are, and by we, I mean these doctors and these captured medical organizations are harming not only vulnerable young men and women, but also boys and girls in the name of an ideology,
Wow.
in the name of a fantasy, it's evil beyond words. And I think it's something that we all have a role in fighting against.
Amen.
Because this is a battle that is so much more than politics. This is so much more than a culture war. This is something that is concerning our own children and the next 3 generations.
Yeah. Thank you, Chloe. All right, of course.
Chloe, as we've listened to you tonight, we've been very encouraged. You know, there's truth and there's a spirit of truth, and we appreciate the spirit in which you carry yourself, the courage and the honesty. And I think the last thing I'd like for the larger audience to have, because we're going to have a little time with you, is I'd like for you just to comment a little bit on what it's cost you personally to swim against the current of modern cultural cult thinking. And do you regret it?
Do I regret speaking out? Right. Never. I couldn't. I really couldn't. I feel like this is my purpose that I've been called for. And it hasn't been easy. It certainly has not been easy. In more ways than one, I have been fighting a war. But I went into it knowing that it was going to be difficult. Because from the very moment that I decided to stop transitioning, I was faced with backlash. I was faced with hatred. But the reasons why I began to speak up were, I think most importantly, my family. I am a youngest child, and so I never really had to have that experience of helping to raise a child younger than I or babysitting. I never really had that firsthand experience of seeing innocence for what it is until my nieces and nephews came into the world. And they are the most precious things. When I started to help to care for them, when I helped my older siblings out with playing and caring for them, it really started to hit me just how precious innocence is. And it made me start to reflect on my own childhood and how mine was taken away from a very young age. I don't want to see that for my nieces or my nephews or my future children and grandchildren. I want to live in a world where I feel I can raise them without worrying about them getting caught up in some ideology and being ripped away from me or losing parts of their body. I deserved better. All of these children deserve better, and the children of the future deserve better. And my mom and dad, I feel like they were just as hurt as I was. They were lied to by the doctors. None of us were given the truth. And they grieved. They grieved for that daughter they once had. All of my older siblings, they grieved for their little sister. They saw the light leave my eyes the further that I went on this process. And it was a sigh of relief seeing me come back, but the damage had already been done. Our family has not been the same since. I don't want what happened to my family to happen ever again. I don't want for there to be a child torn apart from their family and their siblings in the way that I was. And these other people who I've spoken to have also been through the transition and detransition process are almost like a second family to me too. Even these transgender people who hate me, I love them. I see their suffering. I've been there. I don't want anybody to go through this ever again. That alone is enough to motivate me.